When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
This episode is brought to you by Tidy Cats, here to level up your litter game with their new Performance Plus lineup. Your home is your happy place, your cats, VIPs. So when it comes to the litter box, excellence isn't optional. Choose from products that specialize in max power clumping, low tracking, or odor fighting so advanced, stink won't see it coming. Tidy Cats Performance Plus. Mission mighty, keep it tidy. Shop now at tidycats.com.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man, an 8-episode series, now streaming on Disney+.
A superhero remake, not exactly what we'd expect from an Oscar-winning director.
Action! Simon Williams, audition for Wonder Man.
I'm gonna need you to sign this, assuming you don't have superpowers.
I'll never work again if anyone found out.
My lips are sealed.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man. All 8 episodes now streaming, only on Disney+.
Welcome back to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. I'm your host, John Viscardo, and with me is the great Dr. Warren Dockter. Warren and I did an episode on Generals of Napoleon about Churchill and Hitler's fascination with Napoleon. But today we're going to talk about the man himself, Winston Churchill. You might have seen Warren before. He did a Netflix documentary called Churchill at War with some other experts. It was really good. I highly recommend it. And he has a new project that he's working on. It's actually 6 months old, but it's really interesting. I was listening to it yesterday. It's called Churchill, the Finest Half Hour Podcast. And what is that about, Warren?
Well, I got to say, I mean, it's a whole lot of fun. It's my friend Richard Toy and I, he's a professor at Exeter, basically decided we would do a podcast together. And so what we do is we try to pick a topic that we think people will be interested in. And we'll do, each episode's about 30 minutes, and we talk about Winston Churchill and whatever this particular topic is over about 3 or 4 episodes. So we try to get deep dives in there, and we try to make it accessible but not too academic. And it's just a lot of fun discussing this stuff. So our most recent collection that we recorded was about Churchill in Ireland, all the way sort of through his career. And then the one that that had just come out is about Churchill and the General Strike, which I think we did 3 episodes on. Really fascinating.
Yeah, what I like about it is that it's 30-minute snippets of his life. And I mean, we were talking before this podcast, this could be a 15-hour episode on Churchill just because his life was so rich. So to break it down in 30-minute increments, I think is smart.
Yeah, I agree. But one of the things that people forget about Winston Churchill, just his political life starts in 1900. He doesn't formally leave Parliament until 1964, a year before his death. So, I mean, he's got a long political life. And, I mean, he's in some pretty heavy-hitting offices during that span.
Yeah, and a rich tapestry of highs and lows throughout his life.
Yeah, that's right. His political life, and that doesn't include him as a soldier or anything. I mean, he has or as a journalist, he has a lot of things going on throughout his political life, and he's an extraordinarily long-lived man. Remember, this is something I think a lot of people forget about Winston Churchill. He's actually effectively a 19th century guy. He was born in 1874.
Yeah, and he wasn't the pillar of health physically, but he lived for a very long time.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, when he was a child, there were times when his parents had been told that Churchill was kind of sickly, potentially, and there's some early accounts in his early life of being at boys' schools and being kind of sickly and frail. Obviously, he becomes very robust, but then, in later life, he has a heart attack. He has the pressure of the world on him as a prime minister. He has a heart attack. He has strokes. His health starts declining as an older man's would. But also, he never really backed off those cigars or whiskey either. So, makes you wonder.
Yeah, remarkable constitution. Let's start at the beginning. Winston Churchill was born November 30th, 1874 in Woodstock. The son of Lord Randolph Churchill and the American-born Jenny Jerome. What was his upbringing like?
His upbringing's quite interesting, quite standard, but also quite unusual. So Churchill's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was himself the son of the Duke of Marlborough, who lived at Blenheim Palace. And one of the interesting things that happened very early on in Winston Churchill's life, if you read My Early Life, he talks about the fact that his very first memories actually take place in Ireland, because his father and grandfather were sort of sent there as a result of some Victorian scandals that Randolph, who was very impetuous, accidentally sort of got himself involved in with the Prince of Wales at the time. And so as a result, Churchill, one of his earliest memories, and maybe even you could say political memory, was of his grandfather giving a speech in Ireland and everyone sort of reacting to that when he was about 3.5 years old. And this is what he says in My Early Life anyway. But coming up back in Britain, you know, Churchill was sent to boarding school. His parents were very distant.
It's an aristocratic upbringing.
Absolutely. It's deeply aristocratic, and not just aristocratic. I mean, have you ever seen Blenheim Palace? Blenheim Palace was gifted to the first Duke of Marlborough after the Battle of Blenheim. Sir John Marlborough was his name. It's worth actually Googling if you get a chance. It's one of the grandest palaces on earth. I mean, it is one of the places that's like, I'm imposing my grandeur upon you. It's not a place that fits in with the landscape. It dominates everything. So Churchill's not only aristocratic, he's deeply aristocratic.
Oh, wow. It's beautiful. Yeah. Let me share the screen real quick.
Yeah. There it is. And so it has, you know, there's the main house, and then it has two enormous dependencies on the side that are almost reaching out like they're hugging you. But it's a huge palace. So Churchill grew up in that kind of aristocracy. You'd almost associate it with like not being, you know, a millionaire, but a billionaire today. You know, Churchill was sent to very nice schools, although not the nicest. You know, Churchill never went to Eton. Churchill wound up going to Harrow. He went to several sort of other schools. There's a real interesting thing about this. Churchill has a rumor as a student of being a really bad, rowdy student. He hated Latin. He was not a particularly great student. But what's interesting is if you go back into the archives and you look at his report cards from his early school days, he wasn't that bad of a student. He plays up him being poor at Latin and stuff later in My Early Life when he's writing about this part of his life, because it's in the 30s, right, when he's on the backbench.
As you mentioned, Churchill attends a lot of schools, and he also attends the Royal Military College at Sandhurst and became an officer in the British Army in 1895. Were there any early signs that he would become one of the greatest leaders in British history? Because we talk a lot on this show about defining leadership and how to spot it, because obviously if it was in a bottle, everyone would drink it. What do you think stood out about the guy?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think a lot of that actually has to do with a portion of his life at this moment, not necessarily his schooling, but his relationship with his father. And what I want to drill down into there is, you know, I said he had a very distant relationship with his parents, and he was kind of an afterthought, I think, maybe to both of his parents. He talked about how his mother was a bright, shining star who seemed so beautiful, but always at a distance. And his father, whom he sort of grows to idolize, particularly his father's political life, is very harsh with Winston and thinks he's a dullard, calls him a dullard, you know, this kind of stuff. Thinks that he's so poorly behaved and he's slow. And so he had hoped Winston would be a lawyer, but he didn't think he was smart enough. So he enrolls him in military school because he thinks he's only really going to be good enough to be in the military. Now, Churchill tells him at one point that he's interested in this kind of stuff. And Churchill had loads of toy soldiers as a kid, as you can imagine, playing out the Battle of Blenheim. I mean, he had a big portrait of John Marlborough, who's one of Churchill's heroes that he would later go on to write a biography about. You know, Churchill really is interested in kind of military men, military thinking and movements, even if it's a kind of child's, you know, he's playing toy soldiers and that kind of stuff, which is why Randolph thought, well, if he can't be a lawyer, he will be happy in the military. So he goes to Sandhurst, and I think he's very good. He gets put in the cavalry. I think that's one of the places where, you know, but he kind of glides through it. Now, the other thing that's important to remember at this time, that his father dies as well. And his father had a very difficult and slow decline. His father had been, of course, a brilliant politician, very meteoric rise, was a coming man, and at one point was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Basically sort of resigns on a political bluff that Salisbury calls and forces his resignation, and then he kind of slowly declined after that. But his father was also suffering from, and most historians would say probably suffering from syphilis. And so he has a very public kind of mental decline of health. And I think that bothered Churchill a lot, that his father's greatness had kind of been robbed. And this leaves an indelible mark in Churchill's psyche, particularly when he dies, because he never got to have that time to be close with his father. And so it sort of creates a kind of a psychological black hole in Churchill that he needs to fill.
Yeah. And that probably gnawed at him for the rest of his life. Like, I wish my dad could have seen me now. That would have been really amazing.
At the end of his life, one of the very last essays he ever wrote, because also one of the things people forget is Churchill wrote an ocean of words, more words than William Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Anyway, one of the last things he wrote was called The Dream. And in the dream, he claims that he was drifting off to sleep at Chartwell, and the ghost of his father appeared to him. And they were talking politics, and his father wanted to know what all had happened over the last, through the 20th century. And Churchill, of course, tells him of the terrible rise of the Germans and all of these things. And with him telling him his sort of, summing up the 20th century, well, he said, well, what were your role in these events? And before Churchill can tell him, his father's ghost vanishes. And so even in old age, he's never able to really reconcile his feelings towards us. He never gets that cathartic moment that his dad can be proud of him. So a lot of historians, William Manchester in particular, I think, sort of show this kind of that Churchill busies himself pushing himself towards greatness to try to fill this kind of hole.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the other points you touched on there was how much he wrote. As a young officer and war correspondent, he gains fame covering conflicts in India, Sudan, and the Second Boer War. How is he gaining early fame? Is it through his writings or through his military exploits?
So it's both things. I mean, one of the things he told his friend Violet Asquith, would go on to be Violet Bonham Carter, is that, we're all worms, but I'm a glowworm. Like he knows very early on he's gonna make a reputation. So the very first thing that he does, and this is really interesting, is he gets a correspondence dispatch to Cuba, where he writes 5 dispatches, I think, as a press liaison, and he goes there under the auspices with the Spanish. So he's on the Spanish side of this thing, kind of talking about the Cuban revolution that's going on there. And he gets some credibility. He's got 2 papers that are publishing largely through the network that his mother's built of social influences, which he's able to do very early on. So his first stationing is Cuba. Not many people, it's not as widely done. And then he writes quite a bit when he's in India, which later those dispatches would be edited into a book that's not just a collection of the dispatches, but actually shows a lot of deep kind of reflection called the Malacan Field Force. That does quite well. It's just sort of like an adventure book almost, the way he frames it. He writes for a very Victorian audience. But people like the Prince of Wales are sending him notes to say, hey, that was pretty good. Churchill was hugely embarrassed because the first edition of that, he was so in a hurry to get it published that it wasn't proofread properly. People were writing him like, oh, you missed this, you missed that, and it really frustrated him. And a little thing I want to say before we go into the River War, Churchill also, and a lot of people don't know this, Churchill's also conducting military intelligence. So he's sent to Cuba to find out he's on a sort of semi-clandestine mission to find out about the new rifle that the Spanish have. So he can report back because they're using a new type of Mauser that's powderless and so forth. And Churchill's sort of doing a deep dive on that, so he can also report that back. And he's doing very similar things in reconnaissance while he's in India. So Churchill sort of dances in and out of doing kind of like low-key intelligence stuff, which is later in life one of the reasons why he's so interested in espionage. When he goes to the Anglo-Dervish War in Sudan, that's really remarkable. A lot of interesting things are happening there that I think would shape him as a military leader later on. And one of those is he's able to see, now he and Herbert Kitchener kind of hated each other for their career because of the way Kitchener behaved in this. But he learned something very important from Kitchener, I think, which was Kitchener was able to win that war broadly through logistics. Previously when people had gone out to fight against the Mahdi, and I talk about this in my own book, Churchill and Islam, they would sort of take the river as far as they could, and then they get on horses and they go in. And of course, you're subject to the whims of the desert at that point. Kitchener decided, I'm building a railroad track and I'm doing this right all the way down, and it's going to be slow, but we're never going to be out of touch with our supply lines. It's supply lines that win wars. Churchill is able to observe this and write about it and learns that lesson from Kitchener. The other thing that's quite interesting about his development as a writer in this period is he takes those dispatches, he makes another book, and the book's called The River War. It isn't just a book of dispatches, and it's not just an adventure book like the Malacan kind of was. This is an actual history of Sudan. The first edition has 2 volumes. He has a lot of nasty things to say about Kitchener in the volumes that would later come back and kind of hurt his political career, but we can get to that later. Churchill wrote a fantastic book about the Anglo-Sudanese conflict that for years, even when I was doing research, is still considered one of the books you have to read.
Well, there's 2 things I've learned doing this podcast. Leadership is hard to define, and logistics wins wars. So, yeah, I think Churchill was right to listen to Kitchener on that one. Let's talk about the Boer War a little bit. He is captured by the Boers, but escaped from prison camp captivity, becoming a national celebrity in the United Kingdom. I guess, how was he captured and how did he escape?
Tomorrow morning is knocking. Stock your fridge now. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or a sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel, maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
It is this and his writing of this, because he goes again to write his dispatches. He's down there under, like, with a press corps badge. There's a rail car that he's on that gets surrounded by Boers, gets turned over. This is in South Africa, and the Boer force is the sort of separationist group in South Africa who don't particularly want British rule. Typically, they're more Dutch. South African politics are very complex all the time. They're especially complex at this time. And one of the really interesting things is another officer is captured with him. His name was Almer Haldane, and Haldane writes also about this daring escape. Churchill leaves Haldane, and their relationship never quite recovered, although Haldane goes on to be an important general in the Middle East for Churchill later on. So Churchill, he writes about this in his book on the Boer War, which again was a 2-volume book and is a collection of his dispatches, that he was able to kind of work out the timing of the guard and just go over the fence and take off. And he did. It was just one of those kind of like, you know what, I'm going to go for it. And he thought, I'm a press guy. They can't really do anything to me without kind of breaking conventions. Now, what was really interesting from the Boer perspective, they were convinced he was a spy, that he wasn't actually press, that he had this kind of military, he'd written publicly about military intelligence before. And so they assumed that he was a spy. And if you see the wanted poster, which you can go online and Google, there's this picture of Churchill, hand-drawn picture, and it says he's a spy, that there's this award. They're going to give out money for him to be captured and brought back in and shot. So Churchill writes about this wonderful in his book about how he escaped. He's kind of living rough on the countryside, trying to get back to friendly territory. Some people in a farm help him hide at one point, but he is able to make his way back to British territory. And when he does, because he had some celebrity, right? He was this writer. He came from a very well-known family. So when he returns, he really is hailed as like this kind of hero who had been captured. He comes home to kind of a Roman triumph. And he sees this as a moment for him, and he understands that. So, he goes back, writes more, and stays there till about 1900, I guess. And, he writes very even-toned about the Boers, very respectfully of the people who captured him. So he's never saying like, oh, these vicious bastards, it's never like that. It's always like, oh, our worthy foe. He frames things in certain ways. That is quite clever. Now, and I should mention, he did try to run in between being in the Sudan and going to South Africa. He did actually try to run in a by-election, which he lost, I think 1899. But then he sort of comes back from South Africa and runs successful.
Enters Parliament in 1900 as a Conservative MP, but later switches to the Liberal Party in 1904 over trade policy disagreements. So my question is, just looking at his career that was about to come, how devout was he to his politics in general? Like, did he really believe in the party stuff or just what he believed?
No, that's a great question, and it's a question historians have tried to grapple with. Before I start down my version of this, I want to point everyone to Paul Addison. He wrote a brilliant book called Churchill on the Home Front and another book about Churchill's politics. And I would recommend that book to anyone interested in the politics of this era anyway. So Churchill would tell you he took his politics from his father. And his father was what he sort of created a kind of splinter group of the conservatives called Tory democracy or Tory Democrats, which was kind of a liberal wing of the conservative party. So his father was a little bit of a wild card politically. You know, he wouldn't be a radical, but he plays with radical ideas, particularly on Irish home rule and stuff like that. Churchill himself, I don't think, was ever an ideologue for the Conservative Party. He's not a typical conservative. His political view, in my opinion, and in Paul Addis's opinion, which is really where I take this, was he was a centrist. He didn't really care about domestic politics all that much, ultimately. He was bigger fighting grander games in his mind about where the British Empire should be or what Britain should be. And the kind of like, oh, well, should the interest rate be at this level or this, the kind of like minutiae of government, he didn't really particularly interest him. Now, he had to deal with it, of course. And so his political view, you might almost say, is American or Americanist in its structure because it was pragmatic, which is a famous American kind of political concept that is, hey, we'll find something that works and we'll do that. So he was about building kind of central government alliances. Another very cynical way to read his switch to the liberals in 1904 is that Churchill's out for himself. And everybody and their brother knew that the liberals were going to win in a landslide in the 1904 election. So he just switched teams. What's really remarkable about this in his politics is that, he gets kicked out of office after the Chennault crisis in 1921, and he goes back to the conservatives and wins. So, he's famous for saying, anyone can rat from a party, but it takes ingenuity to re-rat and come back.
I think it's human nature to want to be on the winning side, but let's talk about his personal life briefly. In 1908, he marries Clementine, his wife, and they go on to have 5 children. He was also a painter in his spare time. What was his personal life like?
The Churchill family, and they've always kind of kept the private life guarded. Now, you can get glimpses of it. He had a very aristocratic life. He, loved his wife unconditionally. He and Clementine had a wonderful relationship. But it was also, you got to understand, a political relationship, as all Edwardian marriages were, right? This is about bringing houses together. But I think it's important, Churchill spent a lot of time with his family for the amount of stuff he had to do. And you can read in his correspondence, particularly his correspondence with his wife, that he was very fond of them. He thought very fondly of them. They're a presence in his mind, even when he's mad at his son Randolph, which was frequent, because his son Randolph was a bit of a tyrant. Churchill had this deep affection for his family and thought of himself, I think, as a family man. You got to remember, Churchill's always busy, even in the Edwardian period. He's taken on undersecretary roles in 1908. He's at Board of Trade in 1910. He's Home Secretary in 1910. He's First Lord of the Admiralty. He's doing so much all the time. And in addition to that, he's always writing, because one of the things I failed to mention earlier is that when he comes back and enters politics, and this is true, by about 1904, when he switches party, because he's working on the biography of his father, he's the highest paid writer in Britain. So his profession is a writer. And he would always have said that, professionally, I'm a writer. I just happen to be in politics.
Right. And when you say yes to a bunch of work things, then you're saying no to a bunch of family things. So it must be tough.
And so I think, I do think it would have been very difficult for Clementine, because she, I think, necessarily understood she's kind of parenting alone. And he would come and he'd do what he could, but he was, he's busy. The other thing is that I think she understood that she was secondary, and that his needs of his political career came first, and she had to kind of manage the home life, which, again, that seems unfair, but at the same time, that was how you did it in Edwardian Britain.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that personal life here in a little bit. So you kind of mentioned before, Churchill held several major government posts before World War I, including First Lord of the Admiralty, where he helped modernize the British Navy. What do you think he's learning during this time?
So Churchill, being the kind of writer he was always kind of interested in science fiction. And he tended to think in these kind of military forward things. He was really up on technology. You know, there's a lot of debates about whether or not he invented the tank. He didn't. Like, the idea of the tank been around since Da Vinci, right? But what the genius of Churchill on these kinds of things was that he was able to take other people's ideas and make them work. So with the tank in particular, he read, I guess, around 1903 or 1904, like we know this in the correspondence, H.G. Wells's Land Ironclads, I think, which is about these sort of tanks. Well, during the First World War, Churchill's like, oh, the problem's the mud. We need to be able to move these heavy things across seas of mud. How do you do that? Oh, it's tracks. Oh, okay, well, let's get some guys together. He's First Lord of the Admiralty when he's doing this. So he calls them tanks because they needed to look like the kind of like water tanks you'd have on ships. So it's like this experimental thing that he's kind of pushing. And they work out that you need tractor tracks in order to get through this mud. So it all sort of comes together, and then he becomes a champion of the tank. He's doing the same thing with boats and with fuel. And one of the biggest problems the British Navy suffered with during the Edwardian era is everyone's kind of agreed there's a coming war with Germany. Nobody's exactly sure what it looks like. The Germans themselves are like, yeah, we're going to beat you out. You know, I mean, it's difficult when the Kaiser's like, yeah, I'm looking for action, you know, to walk back from that. So Churchill is like, we've got to get away from coal. Coal's a serious problem. There's logistical supply line issues. Even this early on, you've got minor disputes going on with coal in Wales. And so he thinks, God, we got to do something about other ways to fuel this. What's cleaner, cheaper, and more cost effective is oil. And so he takes very serious moves very early on to see that's the future. And he goes down with other leadings, and they could create the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which, of course, later becomes BP. This all kind of starts with Winston Churchill in Iran, which, of course, was Persia at the time, and sets up these oil fields to be a continual supply for the British Navy. And this is going on about 4 years before the outbreak of war. So he sees the Navy's got to get updated, and in a very short amount of time.
And I think through this, he's learning how government works, how reforms work. And maybe, once World War I starts, he's getting a little cocky, like, all right, I think I have this figured out.
Well, I think that's true. And your point about him working out how government works, I think is very true, to build those kind of consensus. And I should say that one of the things about Churchill is the fact that whatever hat Churchill wears, whether it's Home Secretary or First Lord of the Admiralty or whatever, he puts 100% of his heart and soul into that position.
Yeah, this next part, though, is probably his greatest, I would say, disaster on his resume. He's heavily criticized after the failed Gallipoli campaign during World War I, fighting the Ottoman Empire, and temporarily resigned from government. We see it also in World War II, where he pushes for the Italy front. Was he ever a good military strategist, and how did he recover from the Gallipoli disaster?
I'm going to start by saying everybody who's interested in this needs to read a book by Christopher Bell called Churchill and the Dardanelles, which is about the Gallipoli campaign. So I'd point your listeners to that. Let's start with the failure of Gallipoli. Churchill got into a huge fight with Kitchener, and he and Kitchener were sometimes on the same side, sometimes not. Also, Jackie Fisher, who was the sort of main admiral under the First Lord, which was Churchill's role, about whether or not the Dardanelles Straits could be forced by a naval thing alone and gone up, and then Istanbul. The idea was you'd go past the Straits, you'd be able to get into go up into where Istanbul is in Turkey, and they'd see the British Navy and they'd be like, "Hey, the gig's up. We're going to pull out of the war." Now, that seems insane from a retrospective position that these guys are going to do without firing a shot. That's the idea. Now, Churchill's got friendships with some of the leaders, not the main leader, which is the issue, of the Committee of Union and Progress in Turkey. He's carried on a correspondence with some of these guys for years. Talat Bey Pasha is one of them he was quite close to. And they're kind of telling him, hey, if you can give us a show of strength, that gives us enough ammunition to say to Enver Pasha, who's the kind of main leader, that, hey, you got to back off of this. And because you got to remember, up until the First World War, Britain and Turkey had been allied basically since the middle of the 19th century against Russia. It's odd that things have gone the other way. Now, the Enver Pasha was very sort of pro-German and had wanted to bring them on the side with the Germans. Anyway, that's the idea. So Churchill gets there. It becomes very clear very quickly you can't do that. So Churchill gets very frustrated, and Kitchener comes up with the idea, well, we'll do it by land, and they have a landing at Gallipoli. And it's a huge failure. I mean, they lose so many Anzac troops, which are troops from New Zealand and Australia. I mean, it's really catastrophic, and eventually have to admit defeat, which shocks everybody. That Mustafa Kemal, who would later go on to Ataturk, commands an overwhelming, amazing military defensive strategy there that just beats the British. It just does. You know, everyone was shocked that the Ottoman Empire, who'd been the sick man of Europe since like 1840, was actually significantly more powerful than anyone had imagined. And so Churchill is shamed by this. And basically, there was a whole commission about who was putting together this group. They were called the Easterners. There's the Easterners, the Westerners. The Westerners wanted to focus on the Western Front. Churchill had understood the slaughter that was happening there and thought, we've got to do something else. And as a result, he really pushed the Dardanelles campaign. And then, because nobody wanted to take Kitchener off the table, because he's kind of the most important military thinker in Britain at this time. And, you know, he's the guy on the poster that's pointing and got the mustache. Churchill becomes the fall guy for the campaign.
He did. But to put it all on one guy's desk, you know, it could be the generals at the landing. It could be the supply team. You know, it was unfortunate that he got blamed with all of it.
Right. I mean, a lot of that goes down to Jackie Fisher, who, and, you know, they're arguing. The guys on the ground are arguing. I mean, there's a lot of places where this breaks down, but it all lands on his desk. So he's kicked out of government. To make recompense for this, and I think this is amazing, Churchill himself signs up and goes to the Western Front and fights in the trenches, which is unthinkable to imagine any military leader today that's like, hey, I got this one wrong, I'm going with the guys on the front. He does that because he feels so guilty about the losses of Gallipoli. And he had always imagined himself as this grand military fighter. And I think Churchill, as a military thinker, learned about 1 million lessons from this failed expedition, you know, that you see play out in the Second World War. You know, he was always seen as a bit of a maverick and stuff. He's able to come back and get into power through his friend Lloyd George, who, you know, asked with his kind of vote out because the war keeps going on. Lloyd George gets in and kind of makes a position for him in his cabinet, and that brings Churchill back into power. And then he becomes Lord of Munitions, and then First Lord of War and Air. And, you know, there's a sort of stepping stone with him and Lloyd George, who are good friends. And Richard and I sort of argued, and Richard's right because he wrote a book called Lloyd George and Churchill. But I'm always like, hey, this is a bro doing a bro a solid. Like, hey, come back and help us out. And Richard's position is actually Lloyd George saw that Churchill could be dangerous if he's out of power, because then you've got a political opponent, right? Lloyd George sees an opportunity to give him something that keeps him in the tent, and he does that. And so that's how Churchill's able to kind of come back into power after this disastrous thing. And I mean, he takes this on personally. This hurt, you know, this stays with him.
Yeah. I do want to come back to it. There was a post I saw that he was a bricklayer in his spare time also. What do you think he was doing in this hobby?
So bricklaying was certainly a means that he would use to kind of deal with stress. That sort of more came into him in the 20s and 30s after the war. And it was something he loved doing during his what he called his wilderness era. He spent a lot of time at Chartwell rather than being in London, because he was out of any kind of formal office. He was still in Parliament. And he spent a lot of time working on the house. And he did that to busy himself. He was always one of these people that wanted to stay very, very busy. And Churchill had suffered from what he called the Black Dog, which was a sort of depression that he had. This has been heavily debated. The American biographer, William Manchester, kind of makes a bigger deal out of the Black Dog than I think is necessary. And later, there's a guy named Attenborough who wrote a book about the Black Dog and Churchill. And they kind of worked out that Churchill didn't really suffer from depression. He kind of had anxiety issues, and that was the driving force behind a lot of this. But what was very clear is two things to me. Churchill busied himself as a means to keep whatever anxiety or depression away. Idle hands is the devil's workshop. So he made himself busy all the time. Bricklaying is a part of this. But another part of this is painting. And he took painting on almost immediately after Gallipoli. And a friend of his, Wilfred Scowen Blunt, who I've done a lot of work on, recorded his diary. They were at New Buildings together, which is sort of a place on vacation. And Churchill tried painting for the first time there. And Blunt was with him and recorded that Churchill looked at his hands. He had paint on his hands. He said, he looked at it and he described it as the blood of the men that he sent to their deaths. So he was, in my opinion, he was sort of using painting as a means of almost coping with the guilt surrounding Gallipoli. And he would paint the rest of his life and his career. And Churchill became a very good painter, to even the point that he entered paintings into competitions under aliases and would win.
So you and I were talking before we came on, and what that does is it resets the brain. If your job is thinking and you're having trouble, you can't just think more to get through that. You have to step away from it.
Right. That's absolutely right. I remember when I was learning piano, sometimes you got to get up and walk away from the thing and do something else for an hour. And then when you come back, it'll be there. You know what I mean? And that's true of kind of anything. It's like your brain needs some time off. And I think painting, bricklaying, Churchill was very interested in animals. He had a fish pond at Chartwell. I mean, a lot of the things that he enjoyed doing to de-stress involved being busy, but it also gave him a way to kind of process through stuff, I think.
I didn't know before he was prime minister, he had a scheduled lunch with this guy, Adolf Hitler. And then Hitler didn't show up for the lunch because he was busy or late. Or anyway, he waited, I think, an hour and he didn't show up. Churchill warned repeatedly about the rise of Adolf Hitler and the threat posed by World War II, why many British politicians favored appeasement. What did Churchill see in Hitler that other British politicians didn't see?
Let's start with the sort of meeting that never happened. So there's a great book that Catherine Carter's written, and she has a chapter on this, and it's quite interesting. Churchill was overdoing research for his biography on John Marlborough, and there was a son of Randolph Churchill who had a mutual acquaintance who knew Hitler. And Hitler, this is before this is in 1932. This is really before things kind of amp up for the Nazis. And he said, hey, this Hitler guy is probably the common man in Germany. You ought to at least meet him. And Churchill was open to meeting him, and Hitler was open to meeting Churchill. No, they never met. And the reason's very interesting. Is that, one of the things I think Churchill says is that, this anti-Semitism thing, I don't get it. I get that you're doing this to kind of feed some of your political base, but that's kind of a messed up way to think. And, you can tell him that. Maybe I can talk to him about it when we meet. And so I think the idea is that maybe this sort of the intermediary kind of said this to Hitler, and then Hitler thought, well, I'm out. I'm not meeting with this guy. Churchill just wasn't willing to, he had several Jewish friends. He'd always been a friend to the Jewish people in Britain. He'd been an advocate for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine in the First World War. So Churchill, of course, he's going to be like, hey, this anti-Semitism element of your party you're putting together, I don't get that. And this so upset Hitler, Hitler refused to take the meeting.
Yeah, maybe appeasement is not the right word. They just went through World War I. It was horrific for Britain. They lost many people. But you have Neville Chamberlain and King Edward and all these other people are like, no, Hitler's, we just need to give him this Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, and then everything will go back to normal.
Well, see, and I think that's a part of it, right, is that like a lot of the conservative, people like Halifax, for instance, and Chamberlain, they had this idea that the real threat is the Soviet Union. And Churchill, for a long time, thought the real threat was the Soviet Union. He was very anti-Bolshevik, and to the point where he was like, hey, this Mussolini guy, if you read Great Contemporaries, his book, he's not kind to Mussolini, but he's pretty soft on him compared to his words for Hitler, right? So he sees maybe fascism, there could be something in it. Now, this is, again, very early on before we see what fascism evolves into. But he's kind of open to these strong men in the terms of Italy. There's something about Hitler that Churchill's like, absolutely not. And I think it's about anti-Semitism. Churchill abhorred political violence, I think. Now, this is odd to say for a man involved in so many wars and as a man who you could argue was a warlord in the Second World War. But if you read his writings about the Turkish, the massacres, they called them in those days, the Armenian massacres that were taking place at the hands of sort of, renegade Ottomans and this kind of stuff, particularly after the fact of the First World War, he was very upset by this. That kind of thing really made Churchill distraught. I mean, he would even cry sometimes, I think. I mean, he would feel these things. And so, that Hitler flirted, not just flirted, but was deeply anti-Semitic, but flirted with political violence as a solution in his own writings very early on, I think made Churchill recognize this guy's not like other leaders. And I think that's something that the other sort of intelligentsia inside the Conservative Party at the time kind of misunderstood. Because people like Chamberlain, in Chamberlain's defense, he was a 19th century politician, deeply, in a way, so was Churchill. Yep. But Chamberlain was like, well, if a gentleman says he only wants the Sudetenland, that's the end of what he wants. He didn't understand that Hitler was a 20th century monster. He didn't have the imagination for it. Churchill did.
Well, Churchill becomes Prime Minister of Britain in 1940 after the resignation of Neville Chamberlain. Also, France falls to Germany around this time. How did Churchill, of all people, attain this lofty position?
Well, you can imagine we've all seen Finest Hour or Darkest Hour, all the stuff about that moment. You can imagine Churchill, who'd been wanting to be in this seat his whole life. Chamberlain brought back in it, put him in the First Lord of the Admiralty during the early phases of the war. This is kind of a poison chalice because it's like, okay, congratulations. Everything's falling apart. It reminds me of that scene in Spaceballs when he's like, it's a very lovely ship. I think you should go down with it. Churchill must have kind of felt that a little bit, that he finally got the thing he wanted and everything on Earth that could go wrong is going wrong. And I mean, that's where the phrase keep buggering on, KBO, he put that at the bottom of his memos, all right, let's go. It's just like, let's get to work. And he did. I mean, remarkably, he put all of his energy, all this sort of energy that he maybe didn't know what to do with at times that had been previously put into bricklaying and whatever, crazily fighting against Gandhi in 1935 around India. But anyway, I think Churchill was handed a really difficult situation in 1940, as we know. But his instinct was, these guys are evil, and I got to fight them. The king understood Churchill's position, and they were very good friends. And I think the king understood that Churchill understood the biggest threat in Europe is Nazi Germany, not the Soviet Union. I mean, there's a lot of sharks that there were openly at war with the Germans, but like Germany is different. It's going to eat. I mean, this thing, they've got a lot of bad blood from the First World War, and what they're doing in May 1940, I mean, the fall of France was unthinkable. And it happens in like 2 weeks. And it's like, holy cow, Dunkirk is, Churchill, you got to remove, got to resurface, reshuffle, and strategically retreat, as Churchill would say. But what I think is really important is a couple things. One, the other conservatives, Lord Halifax, they'd been breaking bread with people like Hermann Goering as late as 1938. So they couldn't be the leaders that were like, that Britain needed at the time. They couldn't. And so, for instance, Halifax, who was the other alternative, he and Hermann Goering were famously friends. I mean, they went on hunting parties together, pictures of them together, having a big laugh. I mean, so it can't be him. It has to be Churchill. And Churchill, I think, understands that. And the other thing is that during this dark moment when it's like everything is lost, I mean, Boris Johnson, in his book on Churchill, I love this phrase, referred to Churchill as the crowbar of history. I mean, this is that moment. And he not only meets the moment, is able to convince Parliament to fight on, and that's what the movie's about, but he's also able to give speeches that inspire the nation. I mean, the roar of the lion, right?
How did he lead? Meaning, what was his leadership style? Because I also find it interesting. He stayed in London during the Blitz. He didn't run off to the countryside. He shared in the dangers.
Wartime leader. It's hard to do better than Winston Churchill. I mean, I've always said, I did an interview with David Petraeus in Nashville, General David Petraeus. And I asked, my very first question was, who do you think the greatest leader of the 20th century was, and why is it Winston Churchill? I was there for a Churchill Society function, so we all sort of laughed. But You know, Churchill, his leadership was at a strategic, even beyond strategic, at a national level, it's at a symbolic level even. I mean, this is a moment when he becomes the bulldog. He's like, we're going to fight them. And he gives voice to it. And, you know, this is a really interesting thing because his voice is so powerful. And I don't just mean his literal voice, although that's kind of interesting too, because A.J.P. Taylor was a historian at my PhD supervisor. He said that you would hear Hitler on the radio and he made you think he was capable of anything, that he was terrifying. This man is like Lord Sauron. This guy is unstoppable. He can do anything you can imagine. But he said, then you heard Churchill on the radio, and Churchill made you believe you could do anything, that you could withstand this man. And I've always thought that was a tremendously powerful way to put that.
I think that's a great point. If you listen to Hitler's speeches, it's I did this and I'm going to do that and I'm going to, and then Churchill's was we are going to fight them, we're going to win. And he also did, which I think is interesting, management by walking around, you know, visit the airfields, visit the soldiers going into battle, fire a machine gun with them, be seen with them.
Be a part of it. I mean, he desperately wanted to be a part of it. One of the really interesting and more moronic moments of his leadership, which almost causes a constitutional crisis. Nobody really talks about this. Churchill is desperate to be on the ground at D-Day. So much so that he's got people putting together an armored battleship cruiser just for him. And he is like, I've got to be there. I've got to lead from the front. That's the kind of leadership I do. Now, we need to pause there for a second. As a military leader, that's one of the lessons he learned from Gallipoli, is that he wasn't there at Gallipoli, and he thought if he had been, he could have made the difference. So he has a genuine, this isn't just about being seen to do something. He has a genuine desire to lead from the front because he can't risk D-Day being like Gallipoli. That would be unthinkable. And you know, if you know this, of course, Eisenhower wrote 2 letters, right? Eisenhower's like, we might lose. So Churchill wants to be there. Okay, they're designing this thing. It was called Operation WC, which, of course, in English language is the toilet, the water closet.
Yeah.
Well, he tells the king, and the king's like, well, I'm coming. If you're going, I'm going to go. That's unthinkable. The king can't be in danger, and the king and the prime minister both can't be in danger. That's crazy. And then they decide, well, yeah, we'll both go. Well, they write to Clementine and they write to their wives, and they're both like, absolutely not. This is the craziest thing either of you've ever said. The private secretary of the king is able to talk the king out of it and then says, you've got to talk Churchill out of it. Churchill is on his way to the special craft that they've built for him. So he's on the train, and he and the king are riding back and forth. And it's almost caused a constitutional crisis because the king says, well, I'm ordering you not to do this. It's insane to think today. But, you know, this is a guy who went to the front in the First World War. He's not afraid to do it. And so this isn't, again, it's not about the show. It's because he wants to be in the fight. You've got a real constitutional crisis stepping up. And Churchill says, you have no authority because I'm going to be on a British naval boat and you control the land. Your authority is on Britain. And basically, the king has to dig up some law about how the fact that when you're on a British boat, you're actually on English soil. And so that his authority does extend. I mean, there's all this, like, they're going back and forth. And eventually he says, think of your family. The king says to church, think of your family. And think of the poor men on the ship who are going to be so nervous to be a target because you have to be there. And Churchill at that stage says, okay, I'm not going to go. So they're able to avoid the constitutional crisis, and they're able to avoid Churchill being on the battlefront. Now, the larger point is about Churchill's military leadership. Now, we talked about him as a symbolic leader for Britain, his voice, his language, at which he is 10 out of 10, A++++, best of the 20th century, in my opinion. As a military strategist, not great.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, that's an example of the fact that, like, his vision's skewed about what he can and can't achieve personally. You know, when Churchill, when he won the Nobel Prize for his speeches, and famously they said, oh, he gave the roar to the lion, that he gave the lion its roar. He said, well, I like to think I also gave it its claws. You know, he sort of was affronted that he was not a great military strategist. And the truth is he wasn't.
So how did Britain turn the tide of the war? Was it the victory over German forces at El Alamein in Africa, or was it the code breaking of the German Enigma communication system? Or
I don't think it's either of those things. I think that you can see Churchill's hand in both of those. And this is what I mean about him being at the top, being the symbolic national leader. So, number one, he understood that America had to be involved. America could not be involved in Europe yet. And so North Africa was a great kind of testing ground for American troops. And that gave America skin in the game in a way that was kind of brilliant, right? So symbolically, it's like, get America in the war and let's give them something to root for. Now, you can get into Montgomery versus Rommel and the real on the ground stuff there. But again, I'm kind of at the 10,000 foot level. And I think getting America deep in that way was a remarkable, and I'm making it sound like it was just Churchill. That, of course, is not the case. And I think that's important to talk about. And that dealing with Napoleon, it's not, there's a lot of people at play here. And in particular, you got a lot of big personalities like FDR.
Churchill worked closely with President Roosevelt and Soviet leader Stalin, one of the Allied big three leaders. So how important or integral was Churchill in persuading the U.S. to enter the European war?
There's a real interesting shift of how the power dynamics works between those three. The first thing from the outset is to say, in the David Reynolds, if you've ever read his book on summitry, Churchill deeply believed, again, about himself being there, being the man of action, that it had to be him meeting with the other great men. He's the one that calls these meetings. He's the one traveling to go meet with FDR and with Stalin. Stalin didn't go anywhere. Eventually he went to Tehran, sure. The point is that for the most part, they came to Stalin, and necessarily so because Stalin's paying the price. I mean, people forget the Soviet Union really took the brunt of the onslaught. I mean, Hitler hated the idea of losing to France and to Britain, but he was afraid to lose to the Soviets. And so, and ultimately that's what happens, really. But that personal dynamic's really, really important about, getting FDR to get into the battle. Leaving, Stalin's saying as early as 42, guys, you got to help. As soon as he's on their side, he's like, I need help. And he did. I mean, Stalin's not trying to even think about the after effects of the war or kind of lay the groundwork for what comes after that. That's much later. He's just like, we're fighting an existential battle to be alive against this sort of Nazi onslaught. So Churchill plays a huge thing in convincing FDR. And even beyond FDR, because FDR agreed with him more or less, I think he played a huge part, again, using his voice, in convincing the American people they needed to be in Europe. And that where you can see in North Africa. And I think that's why when he addressed Congress, I think that had a huge sway, because even the people who opposed him were like, damn, that guy's got a point.
He's good at building coalitions of friends and enemies. I mean, clearly Stalin was not his favorite person, and he was very leery of the guy, but he also needed him and Roosevelt, who was his friend. So he was good at building, I guess, bridges for these different parties to help Churchill get through the crisis.
Oh, that's right. And I mean, what's really interesting is the bridge that he helps build between Stalin and FDR actually starts serving them better than him. I mean, they become quite close, and Churchill gets left out in some of the stuff. I do think Churchill and Stalin kind of got on. I mean, they sort of have that kind of backslapping, like, ha, we're drinkers and we have a good time. And, in a way that FDR was always a bit like, I don't know.
Right.
But I think on a personal level, they did enjoy each other's company. But also, Churchill, no one really trusted Joseph Stalin. And rightfully so. I mean, he's always out for himself. Maybe not even Russia. I mean, out for Joseph Stalin. But I also think that breaking the codes, I just want to go back to that point. The amount of money and time that was spent and put into military intelligence, Churchill got Churchill's fingerprints all over. He himself was interested in intelligence. He was interested in the code breaking. He called them his corkscrew minds, Churchill's war wizard. He loved all that, and he was willing to put, the funding and resources behind this stuff. And I mean, he loved it so much. And I'm someone who taught military intelligence, and I find this difficult. He liked to review the actual decrypts. So he didn't want the analysis that would be given to him. He wanted to analyze it himself. FDR famously hated intelligence briefing. You know, he was just like, whatever, I don't care. And whereas Churchill's like wants to be in it, in the details, in the actual, like, here's the code, let's break the code, you know, which is really remarkable. I also want to say on the point of about what ultimately brings them together and kind of, in my opinion, wins the war. I don't know if you've ever read a book called The Engineers of Victory by Paul Kennedy. It's the most convincing reason for why all this sinks, in my opinion. And in the conclusion of his book, said that it was a culture of encouragement on the Allied side. So, you know, when they're trying to put together how the Spitfires and the new Mustangs would work, we're using Rolls-Royce engine, but we're putting it on these kind of bodies. You just kept, there were a lot of failures. But it didn't matter. Churchill kept going back to this, like, hey, the Pykrete stuff didn't work. Okay, we'll figure something else out. Oh, the codes weren't right. Well, okay, let's figure something else. You know, it's just like, we'll do it. We'll figure it out together. You said this. He says we. He's talking about America. He's talking about the Allied powers. In Germany, okay, you've got the best tanks, right? You've got the Leopards. You've got the Tigers. But if you get it wrong, boy, you've really pissed off a whole lot of people that are all gaming to be Hitler's favorite, right? You know, the Allied leadership was like, we got to get through this thing together. And, you know, there's obviously positive reinforcement, but it's like, you know, guys weren't afraid to just come up with wackadoo ideas. You know, that bomb that bounced on the water. Or another example that he gives is the thing with the hedgehogs that would throw depth charges in the Pacific. You know, just an engineer on a boat one day came up with how you do that. You couldn't release a depth charge so close to your boat or it might blow you up. And so they created these sort of little things. And it was just this idea of like these kinds of engineering feats.
I want to get to post-war because he still has quite a resume to go here. And this is still a head scratcher to me. Britain wins the war. Churchill and the Conservative Party lose the 1945 general election to Clement Attlee and the Labour Party. I still don't understand how Churchill lost this election after leading Britain through the most violent war in history.
What you got to remember, number one, is the British structure in it. You don't vote for a man, you vote for parties. So the Conservatives are running the election. You know, the central government, Churchill, now the war's over, has stopped, and we're going to kind of do the British reset. What you got to remember is, since the 1930s, Churchill says, hey, I'm not like those other conservatives. I'm different. I don't like Nazis. And he spent the last 10 years telling you how unconservative he is, which is how he's able to build a coalition with the liberals and with Labor, right? And with Clement Attlee and people like Arthur Greenwood. And so Churchill is saying, I'm not really one of those conservative guys. I'm doing my own thing. I'm trying to find solutions in the middle. I'm not ideologically driven. I'm here for the British people. Now, Churchill's still the political leader of the Conservative Party, right? But he also overplays his hand because he starts putting out, there's a famous radio speech that he gave where he's saying, oh, you know, if Labor wins this, they're going to have a new Gestapo. It's called the Gestapo speech. And even Clementine's like, pump your brakes, man. This is crazy. Nobody's talking about that. I mean, and it made him sound like he was an out-of-touch old man. And so those two things kind of together, you know, I think was the undoing of the Conservative Party, because Churchill, you know, he'd been in the war. He was a great wartime leader. He had a reputation for being a wartime leader. Not really the guy you want during peace, because, again, like we said at the beginning, he's not really interested in the fine minutiae of government. He's into big state-making stuff. And the final thing I want to say is the kind of genius of the campaigns that were run. So Churchill's Conservative Party run very stodgy old man telling you, oh, the left, they're a Gestapo. Labor ran a really dynamic party, and their posters said, cheer for Churchill, vote for Labor. And that became the opinion of the whole country because they didn't trust the conservatives who'd been soft with the Nazis, particularly at the time when it was coming to light what the Germans had been up to. You got to remember this going all the way back to why Churchill got out of, we kind of skipped over the Chinac crisis, but at the end of the First World War, Churchill and Lloyd George were afraid that Turkey was going to march. You know, they didn't want Turkey to be in Europe at all, and it had marched to unite that part of Turkey with the other part of Turkey. Churchill and Lloyd George were like, we're going to go to war to stop this. This is literally like right after the peace conference in 1990. So this is 1921, 22. And it's called the Chinac crisis, and they're trying to stop the Turkish from going in. And Churchill says, well, we're willing to go to war for this without checking it is Churchill and Lloyd George, without checking with any of the imperial holdings, any of the Commonwealth or the Allies at all. They're just like, we're going to stop them. And everybody immediately put out a press release like, no, we're not. We got no dog in this fight at all, bro. And that created such a crisis. It broke the Lloyd George government. And it also sort of kept, I mean, it knocked Lloyd George out of serious power for the rest of his life. And so there was this idea that's like, you can't, if we let Churchill in charge of stuff after the fact, remember what happened last time.
He returns as prime minister from 1951 to 1955 and remains an influential Cold War figure, famously warning about the Iron Curtain dividing Europe. And again, we see his ability to recover. So I'm going to let you discuss those two speeches.
In opposition, 1946, he gives, in March, he goes to Fulton, Missouri in America and gives the famous Iron Curtain speech, which is actually called the Sinews of Peace. And in that speech, he lays out a vision of three major things. The first is the Iron Curtain, that actually it was the Soviet Union was the problem, and that the Iron Curtain had descended, and we don't really know what's going on over there. They're up to no good. So that defines the rest of the 20th century, really up until 1989. The second part of that speech, which also defines the next part of the 20th century, is he starts calling for a real close relationship with Europe. Now, it's not really until September 1946, I think I don't know if it was Zurich or anyway, he gives a speech called the United States of Europe, where he calls for Europe to be integrated in the same way. And this becomes, this sort of lays the groundwork for how Europe would behave for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st century. The third thing that he lays out is the special relationship, which of course had existed, but America and in particular Anglophone countries would have to exist as a united front. And so you have America and Britain as two major players in this special relationship, but there's also Canada, Australia, what we call the Five Eyes. And it creates, these three things define what happens to the rest of the 20th century.
He wins the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953 for his historical writings and speeches. And then, lives to 1965 and receives a state funeral widely regarded as one of the largest in British history. So I guess my final question is, what is his legacy?
That's a really difficult question. And here it's the enormity of the figure. We're now, about 100 years away from Churchill, not his death, but from when he was sort of politically active. We're 200 years away, if not more, from Napoleon. Napoleon's still too big to sum up. You can't make a movie about Napoleon's life, as we've seen recently with Ridley Scott's attempt, because it's too big. And that's also true of Churchill. It's hard to sum up because the man was in everything and he was there for so long. And there are different people who've looked at it in different ways. One of my favorite, Robert Rhodes James, wrote a book called Churchill, A Study in Failure, and it looked at his life up to 1939. You know what I mean? And you could make a case that he's this goofy, weird guy that keeps going from thing to thing, kind of works, kind of doesn't. And then World War happens, and he's the absolute right man for the job. Saves the world, arguably. And then it's like, okay, bye, thanks. Now, and some of the other stuff that we don't really have time to get into is his 51 to 55 government does some really important stuff. It helps bring about a détente with the Soviet Union. It lays the groundwork for how humanity is going to deal with the hydrogen bomb, because he's still influencing Truman and Eisenhower. He's able to bring Eisenhower together with Khrushchev for their meeting in 1949 as a kind of elder statesman. It lays a lot of the groundwork for how that portion of the Cold War would work up till, I would argue, a kind of Nixonian era or maybe even later.
He was a success in World War II. World War I, probably debatable.
Debatable, I think. It depends on who you ask, right? So if you ask someone from Britain or America, was he a success? Absolutely. If you ask someone in India, probably not. They're different. Churchill, I think you get into those questions about him being a man and having flaws. Churchill held 19th century ideas about people, which often meant that he was racist, as we would conceptualize it today. And I think sometimes can even be considered that by his contemporaries. But at the same time, he had this kind of unwavering faith in the British Empire and Britain, and so he's a complex figure, and understanding these complexities of how he ruled. Sometimes Ireland would have called him a hero, and at other times Ireland would have called him a villain. He sat down and did everything he could to work with Michael Collins. But Eamon de Oliveira famously hated him and even sent a letter of condolences to Nazi Germany when Hitler died. Yeah. I mean, so it's a complex legacy. It's about who you ask. But from my perspective, he remains one of the most fascinating figures of the 20th century. In terms of the big books about him, Martin Gilbert's biography is still bar none the best one. I also like Andrew Roberts' biography, although I disagree with much in it. But I think Roberts is still a worthy contribution to the literature. Of course, for me, what's been influential, Churchill's Empire by Richard Toye, I think is one of the most brilliant books about the philosophy that guides the man. Paul Addison's book I mentioned about his domestic policy. My own work focuses more on his view of cultures, in particular in a kind of colonial phase around Islam and people from India and that kind of stuff, which I think is tremendously important now in particular. But again, Gilbert's work and anyone that focuses on that special relationship, I think, is so important. But one of the lasting and enduring legacies of Winston Churchill is that there is a special relationship between the UK and the US. And even my friends in Britain are like, no, I don't think there is. A lot of people here are like, what's special? What are you talking about? It's codified in law. There was an act passed in 1943 called the Bursa Act, which is a British and USA act that said we would share intelligence. Later, it was codified as the US-UK law in 1947. The fact that we have a special relationship is legal, and it's publicly documented, and it gets forgotten about because it's clandestine stuff and whatever. But there is a fundamental Churchillian legal ethos that goes through all of our buildings and work in Washington and in London. And people forget that.
Well, if you'd like to learn more about Churchill, you could also check out Warren Dockter's podcast, Churchill, the Finest Half Hour, which you can find wherever podcasts are heard. And we thank Warren for his time.